Octavian Augustus, adopted son of Julius Caesar, held dominion over the vast Roman Empire for 56 years, the longest reign of any European monarch. The concentration and limits of his power were unparalleled in Roman history. However, Octavian had no heir to whom he might leave his kingdom.
His Excellency ponders his own mortality this night. Ah, what's to become of your empire? Who will rule in your place? You've come to ask the gods. But most excellent Augustus, I thought that you yourself were a god. Why do you need a mere mortal's help?
Who is a troll?
Ancient and all-powerful gods, hear me. Jupiter, Janus, Mars, answer our call. Hear our plea. Who is to reign on the throne of Rome after your servant Octavian has crossed over to Hades? Hearken, Gaius Octavius. The gods have blessed you in your kingdom. Never before in the world of mortals has there been such a vast and powerful empire. But the days of your reign are counted. Now hear the words of the most powerful and mighty God, who rules over all the men of earth and all the gods of heaven. Another king is about to be born in the far-off land of Palestine. The days of his sovereignty will be without number. Kingdom will one day conquer all of Rome.
Kill her.
Octavian Augustus's Rome was grand indeed. Romans were without equal in construction, planning, and skill. Many of their roads, aqueducts, and bridges are still in use 2,000 years later. Their legal, political, and social accomplishments have left an indelible mark upon all of Western civilization. The legend of Octavian's visit to the sorceress who supposedly lived here on Campanella Hill is probably just that, a legend that developed years after the events had already unfolded. However, during Octavian's reign, a certain Jew was born in Palestine who was reputed to be the Son of God. Now, in the 300 years that followed, the disciples of Jesus of Nazareth, even though they were cruelly persecuted and martyred, won over the entire Roman Empire to their faith. Through the centuries, this era continues to fascinate us. I mean, why? Why did the Romans so cruelly persecute the Christians? How did the church survive at all when the cost of being a convert could be death? And who were these early Christians who, in spite of incredible pressures, remained steadfast in their beliefs? We will tell a part of the story of these martyrs or witnesses to Christianity, because that is what the word martyr means, witness. We will follow 5 such Christians who lived in Rome during those turbulent years. And we will try to make these accounts as accurate as possible. In the last century, archaeologists have unearthed a great quantity of evidence, such as inscriptions, monuments, and written texts confirming each of their existences. And surprisingly, these recent finds have also given added weight to many of the legends that have survived the centuries. Once there must have been documents, such as court records, detailing the facts concerning each of the martyrs' trials. Most of these accounts have been destroyed or embellished so elaborately by later generations that trying to pick out the truth from the fiction is at best difficult and in some cases impossible. Nevertheless, this uncertainty should not diminish the value of trying to understand both the reasons why these Christians stood so firm in their faith and the historical and social settings in which their martyrdoms took place. In those first centuries, it was indeed true that all roads led to Rome. Just a few hundred yards from Rome's Flavian amphitheater, better known to most of us as the Colosseum, stands St. Clement's Basilica. Within a short time of Jesus' death and resurrection, approximately 30 AD, the first converts to this new faith had made their way to the hub of the Roman Empire. When St. Peter arrived here several years later, there was already a thriving Christian community. And Rome was soon to be torn apart by this controversial religion. As we journey back through time, let's see what we can discover about the lives of those early Roman Christians. The pagan and Christian worlds were intertwined from the very beginning. Even the term basilica was a pagan word for meeting or gathering place. The present-day Basilica of St. Clement was completed in the 12th century. There had been legends passed down through generations that St. Clement, the 4th Bishop of Rome, was actually connected with this building. However, it wasn't until 1879 that it was discovered that under these very floors, where for centuries the faithful had kneeled and prayed for St. Clement's intercession, actually lay the original home of Clement himself. We now know that there are actually 3 levels under St. Clement's, each one delineating a different period of time. The first or lowest level is approximately 39 feet under the current floor of the basilica and dates all the way back to 200 BC. Now, that original home was destroyed in the 1st century AD by Nero's Great Fire. And another home was built on the site of those ruins. You see, the Romans would fill in the existing structures with rubble and then build on top of the remains of the old home. Not only did this help solve the Romans' waste disposal problem, but this method of construction has proved to be a great boon for archaeologists. At this time, the ownership of a home was indicated by a plaque, what they called a titulus, which was placed on an exterior wall. Such a plaque archaeologists discovered here with the name of Clemens, which is the Roman equivalent of Clement, inscribed on it. What an exciting discovery that was. Scholars have debated for some time as to whether this Clemens is the bishop or not. Some contend that the home really belonged to the first century Roman consul Titus Flavius Clemens, who was a cousin to the emperor, and that the bishop was really his freed Jewish slave. Well, whatever the facts, the association of this church and the saint cannot be denied. In the 4th century, a church was built on this spot, and it stood until it was destroyed by fire during the sack of Rome 700 years later. The present-day basilica was constructed on the remains of that church. In fact, the altar is directly above this one. This narrow passageway, believe it or not, was once an actual Roman street. I mean, if this were the 1st century, we'd be outdoors. But today you have to use your imagination to picture the blue sky overhead, to hear the sounds of people hurrying by on the way to the market or the Colosseum, to feel the breezes blowing around the corners of the buildings. Now let's walk down this street. As we walk down, we come upon the remains of a temple dedicated to the ancient Persian sun god Mithra. And across the way, the home of St. Clement. It was probably in this very home, just across from the pagan temple, where 1st century Christians met together to celebrate the Eucharist, which means good Thanksgiving. As the Christian community grew, it sometimes became necessary to take over whole houses, which probably happened here in the 2nd century. St. Clement is believed to have been a disciple of the Apostle Peter, who was martyred in Rome during Nero's reign in approximately 67 AD. In a letter written toward the end of the 1st century, St. Clement shed some light on the reasons behind the deaths of both St. Peter and St. Paul, who was executed 2 years later. He wrote, "To these men who lived such holy lives, there was joined a great multitude of the elect, who by reason of rivalry were the victims of many outrages and tortures. What or who was the cause of this rivalry is unknown. However, we do know that there were many misconceptions about the early Christians."
Let me in! Let me in! I want to see my wife!
Cecilius!
Theodora, what are you doing with these people?
Peace, brother. We're all friends here.
Please.
No, Cecilius, no.
She's my wife. I can't see. I can't see.
This is the remains of a fresco found in the 4th century basilica. It tells the story of that jealous husband whose name was Sicinius. His eyesight was restored by St. Clement's prayers. This undoubtedly had a rather profound effect upon Sicinius, and he was persuaded to become a member of Clement's flock. During the reign of the Emperor Trajan, it is believed that St. Clement was banished to the Crimea, where he either died from the extreme conditions of his exile or was martyred. At any rate, what evidence we have supports the fact that he disappeared from the Roman Church at the turn of the 1st century, never to return. Romans had long been known for their religious tolerance. They readily embraced the gods of Greece and were quick to add any new god they encountered to their public devotional celebrations. Even the Jews, though viewed with disdain, were allowed to continue their religious practices. But during the first 2 centuries, rumors ran rampant in Rome and throughout the empire that this new sect held strange and mysterious ceremonies. It was believed that Christians sacrificed babies on their altars and that they held clandestine orgies. Well, now, all of this was disturbing enough to the highly moral Romans, but what was even worse This new sect rejected any small expression of veneration for the Roman gods. This was inexcusable. You see, the Romans believed in an ordered universe controlled by the gods of Olympus. As long as mortals showed them appropriate devotion, these gods would continue to bless Rome and its people. Many believed that the Christians' lack of respect would turn the gods' favor into anger. In fact, as time went on, every calamity that befell the people of Rome and its provinces was blamed upon the Christians. In addition, since the time of Octavian and Augustus, emperors were declared to be gods, and worship of them became a part of Roman nationalism. But no matter how severely threatened, the Christians stubbornly refused to acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. The refusal to worship the emperor as God was an affront to Roman tradition and was to be the cause of numerous persecutions, the first of which began in earnest in 64 AD when Nero decided to use the Christians as scapegoats for his burning of several sections of the city of Rome in order to expand his palace. Well, he wasn't satisfied with just punishing those he determined to be guilty, so he decided to appease the proletariat's desire for entertainment by turning the torturing of Christians into a public spectacle. So in his gardens on Vatican Hill, he gave a festival each night where the followers of Christ were covered with pitch and turned into human torches in order to illuminate the circus performances. Here in St. Stephen Rotondo, one of the oldest churches in Rome, artists have filled the walls with frescoes depicting the many cruel and merciless ways the Romans devised to torment the Christians into renouncing their faith. They were stabbed with forks of iron, boiled in burning lead, stoned to death, beaten with clubs, hung by their hands with weights tied to their feet. They had their sides scraped with iron tongs. They were roasted on burning grills, and they had their hands cut off and their tongues cut out. What motivated the Romans to treat them so mercilessly? One answer lies in the very basis of the crime of which they were accused. You see, Christians, by the very nature of their beliefs, actually incriminated themselves. All the defendant needed to do to escape punishment was to deny his commitment to his faith and acknowledge the divinity of the emperor. But this was impossible for them. So the magistrates believed it was their duty to use whatever means necessary to persuade these deluded fools into changing their minds. While their harsh methods were occasionally successful, a great number remained faithful under extreme torture. The Christians, on their part, believed it to be a great honor to suffer for the name of Christ. Jesus had warned them that as the world persecuted him, it would also persecute his followers. Miraculously, in spite of these sadistic measures, the church continued to grow. Now, while Christianity remained for the most part a faith of the working people, it did begin to infiltrate the upper classes as well. Even the imperial household found itself occupied by believers in this new faith. Titus Flavius Clemens, remember him? He was mentioned earlier in connection with St. Clement. Well, he was a member of the royal household and a cousin of the Emperor Domitian. Imperial chronicles document the fact that in the year 95 AD, he was executed and his wife Domitilla exiled for the crime of atheism. Now, atheism was a common charge brought against those early Christians because they refused to worship the many Roman gods or to take part in public festivals honoring them. However, in spite of the dangers, many others of the aristocracy were surprisingly attracted to this new faith. This lovely young woman is named Cecilia. She lived in Rome during the 2nd century in a picturesque villa in a very wealthy area of Rome. At a young age, she turned her back on her family's wealth and pagan faith and embraced Christianity. It seems that she was determined to remain a virgin for the love of God. Her father, though, had other ideas and arranged a marriage with a young nobleman named Valerian. Valerian and his brother Tiberius were eventually converted to Cecilia's faith. The brothers' great zeal and their diligent efforts at burying the bodies of the martyrs, who at this point were being killed almost daily, betrayed them into the hands of the authorities. They were both promptly executed. It was not long before Cecilia's loyalty to the Roman gods was also questioned. Saint Cecilia, one of the most greatly venerated maiden martyrs of the early church. For centuries, Cecilia has been named in the canon of the Catholic Mass throughout the world. This is the church named after Saint Cecilia. Today, Cecilia is most generally known as the patron saint of music and musicians. And each year on November 22nd, the anniversary of her martyrdom, the cloistered nuns commemorate her life with prayer and the singing of beautiful hymns. Once again, what you see here at street level is not all there is to this church. Underneath this floor, similar to St. Clement's, lies what is believed to be the original home of St. Cecilia. Many Roman homes were furnished with wonderful modern conveniences. They had hot and cold running water and even private steam baths or calidariums. Underneath the calidarium was a room where a fire was built to warm the tile floor of the bath. Now, getting back to our legend of Cecilia, it is said that she argued with the prefect or judge Almachius at considerable length and greatly provoked him with her stubbornness and wit. Well, he, in turn, sentenced her to death by suffocation right here in the calidarium of her own home. The fire beneath the floor was heated with 7 times its normal amount of fuel. Exhausted soldiers kept that fire burning furiously for a day and a night. And yet, when they opened the door, there sat Cecilia, calmly singing songs of praise to her Lord. And strangely, it sounded as though she was accompanied by a choir of angels. But although Cecilia was able to survive the ordeal of the calidarium, she could not avoid the sentence of death. Somehow, Cecilia's fragile neck withstood the blows of the executioner's mighty sword. Roman law forbade him from trying a 4th time to kill her. So Cecilia was left to die a slow death. She lived 3 days, and it is said that she converted many to the faith during that time. Finally, she turned her face from the world